I got my first glimpse of the 1934 version while watching the 1995 adaptation with Jean-Paul Belmondo. The clips to which we are treated there intrigued me, and after considerable rooting around the internet, I managed to obtain a copy on VHS and then later on DVD. I was not disappointed. This is quite the fullest and most satisfying cinematic version of Hugo's extraordinary tale yet produced. Some may find the running time of around 4.5 hours quite daunting, but I found that I hardly noticed the time pass. The reasons for its success are manifold. Firstly, the detail and therefore the strength of the original are largely retained. Characters are properly fleshed out, and, just as in the original, we feel we share the characters' lives and get to know and care about them. The depth and number of characters are not sacrificed to considerations of time and commerce. Although some of the photography appears quirky and perhaps dated by modern standards, Raymond Bernard's literate script and direction are stimulating and advance the narrative at a steady pace, despite the impression created by the running time. He is masterful in the creation of atmosphere in both intimate and crowd scenes. For example, the film is quite spectacular in its depiction of the 1832 uprising, yet it is deeply moving in the scenes involving Valjean and the bishop. The music, by Arthur Honegger, has great dignity and is entirely apt to the tenor of the film and the themes it embraces. However, if the real strength of the piece is in the depth and conviction of its characters, their cinematic success is due in no short measure to the quality of the acting. Fantine, played by Jocelyne Gaël, is perhaps a little melodramatic for modern tastes, and Javert, played by Charles Vanel, may lack a truly tragic quality, but all told the performances are faithful to the original and convincing, and none more so than Harry Bohr as Valjean. His immense physical presence and slow controlled delivery, combined with his ability to express his inner feelings with little more than a look or a moment's hesitation, command our respect and sympathy, making him the perfect incarnation of the tormented but determined Valjean. This film reeks sincerity and a genuine desire to transfer not just a story, but the spirit of the original onto the big screen. Probably the best known of the early cinematic adaptations, with Frederick March as Valjean and Charles Laughton as Javert, this 1935 version is nonetheless a somewhat sanitised and flawed version. Short on detail and lacking in grit, this is a fairly blinkered if well-intentioned version, concentrating on legal injustice and the plight of released convicts. Even Marius delivers a speech criticising the state for its treatment of ex-cons, rather than broadening the canvas to discuss other social issues as well. Fantine's lamentable situation is sanitised to avoid all mention of prostitution, and while we still feel considerable sympathy for her, the cleaning up of her plight also has the effect of lessening the depth of our feelings for her. The poetry and tragedy of the original are not well served as the storyline itself is cut short, and characters disappear completely or are significantly altered to suit the new framework. Frederick March is sincere, but perhaps lacks gravitas. Charles Laughton, an actor I have greatly admired in other productions, is just not right as Javert. Whether this is due to the script or his playing is open to debate, but to have Javert display emotion, down to the trembling of his lip in one scene, and to have him attempt to place blame on the law rather than accept responsibility for his actions, is to miss the point. This is a more adolescent version than the altogether more rounded, complete and adult French version which immediately preceded it. This 1957 version is the first widescreen and full-colour adaptation of the novel, adapted and directed by Michel Audiard. It is also the result of a Franco-Italian collaboration, undoubtedly intended to broaden the appeal of the film throughout Europe, but which may in the end have done it no great favours. Some of the actors appear to deliver their lines in their native tongue and are later dubbed into French, causing a certain lack of flow and credibility. Fairly theatrical in its conception, the film is rather heavy and has a somewhat staged feel to it, with little camera mobility and a general feeling that the subject matter is being treated with a little too much reverence or even awe. That said, Jean Gabin is an excellent Valjean. He is quiet and thoughtful, giving the impression he has suffered, but is handling his torment with great dignity and stoicism. He is particularly strong in his scenes with Bourvil as Thénardier and Bernard Blier as Javert, lending authority and sincerity to the part. Bernard Blier as Javert is convincing as a man devoted to his work and who believes utterly in the principles he defends, but lacks any element of sympathy or tragedy when Valjean releases him from the barricades and when he discovers Valjean has saved Marius by dragging him from the sewers. These turning points, marking Javert's doubts about the direction of his entire life, are dealt with somewhat summarily in the film and must be considered something of a weakness. In contrast, we have perfect casting and playing in Bourvil as Thénardier. Here is a Thénardier who is at once amusing and vicious, cunning and intelligent. It is to the director's great credit that Thénardier's part has not been as significantly reduced as it so often is in film versions, and Bourvil certainly gets under the skin of the character. There is much to savour and enjoy, but I find it a little staid and too self-aware for my taste. Although much admired by some, I'm afraid I find this a rather workmanlike production. Produced as a television film by Sir Lew Grade in 1978, it shares the weaknesses of many of his excursions into the cinema in the late 70s and early 80s. A lack of sparkle and decent script. The whole production gives the impression of going through the motions rather woodenly, rendering a well-intentioned and undoubtedly sincere version which, sadly, is quite lacking in spirit. Perhaps this version also suffered from an excess of admiration, bordering on awe, for the original, but for me the actors never really become their roles, but play them. Richard Jordan is earnest and sincere but is too young for the part and appears limited to just one register as Valjean ages, while Anthony Perkins plays Javert as heartless and unbending and lacks a spark of ultimate understanding and humanity necessary to suggest tragedy rather than jubilation on his death. Many of the other roles are played by well-known actors whose presence would appear to be of more significance than the parts they play. Once again, Thénardier is almost non-existent, and various liberties are taken with characters and events, the most glaring omission being Valjean's heartbreak and death, replaced by a happy ending. The lack of emotion, however, is due principally to the script, which, while relatively faithful to a large number of the events of the book, does little to relay the emotions aroused by these events. I felt the direction was uninspired and left the viewer curiously uninvolved. For all that, it is an honest and genuine attempt at putting the story on the screen, and deserves credit as such. It was with some trepidation that I approached this version. Made for French television in 1982 and given a cinema release, it is not very well known, and television production values were not always what they might have been in the 70s and 80s. However, I am delighted to say I was very pleasantly surprised by this production, directed and written by Robert Hossein. While there are a number of omissions and relatively minor changes to the chronology, it maintains pace and interest and is generally very faithful and detailed. Indeed, there are very effective scenes dealing with Valjean's arrival in Digne and Monseigneur Myriel, which other producers have not seen fit to include in their productions. It may not have the dynamism or energy of the later Depardieu version, nor the intensity of the 1934 version, but it remains a very worthy addition and does much to capture the emotions of the characters and render the themes of the book. Valjean's motivation might perhaps have been more clearly depicted. We see his pain and the result in his determination to redeem himself, but the reasoning behind the change is left to the audience to divine. That said, Lino Ventura is an excellent Valjean and is surely the main reason for the success of the film. He is convincing, sincere, believable and touching. I was also struck by the way in which Hossein depicted Fantine's degradation through a series of stills, showing her decline and deterioration in health, while we hear readings of Thénardier's letters to her about Cosette. Javert is seen as cold, principled and determined, but to the credit of the production, he is not depicted as some evil monster. Claude Lelouch's 1995 film is more an adaptation of Hugo's tale rather than a filmed version of it. He explores the universal themes of the book and the pertinence of Hugo's message to our history, here applying them to the French experience of Nazi occupation during the Second World War. This is a story of Henri Fortin, an excellent Jean-Paul Belmondo, who sees parallels between his own life and the stories of Valjean et al. It is also a tale of intolerance and love, as told through the experiences of a Jewish family forced to flee Nazi persecution, and how they are helped by Henri Fortin, whose evolution into a caring humanitarian forms a core of the film. Told on a grand scale, Lelouch captures the essential humanity of his characters and has produced a gripping and moving film which is a fitting tribute to the original, a tale which gives us a story of an era through the lives of a myriad of characters, touching on themes of love, faith, revolution and tolerance, among others. He takes these universal themes and creates parallels between his own characters and those of Victor Hugo, while giving us a story of a different era, but one which shares similar problems, thus emphasising the continued relevance and validity of Hugo's original. Some parallels are more successful and complete than others. Here, the Javert character blindly follows orders and may have doubts, but he is cruel and selfish, and it is difficult to have any sympathy for him. World War II replaces the 1832 attempted revolution, and the experiences of the original characters are mirrored in the experiences of the 1995 characters, though not always by their direct equivalents. Monsieur Lelouch succeeds in tapping into our emotions better than most of the more recent straight adaptations, and we have the fun of trying to spot the parallel. That Hugo's themes and points should be equally applicable to an era 100 years after that of the original is testimony to Hugo's insight and the strength of his narrative. However, it can also be regarded as a sad reflection on 20th century European history. This 1998 film is spectacular and lovingly produced, but the director has taken various shortcuts or even liberties with both the characters and events. Apparently filmed entirely on location, there is a coldness, even at times an unpleasantness, pervading the film. The tormented but determined Valjean is well played by Liam Neeson, indeed the acting is of a high standard throughout. My main quibble is with these shortcuts, made perhaps due to considerations of time and commerce. I find it hard to accept that Valjean would strike the bishop. In the book he considered violence, but shrank from it. There should be no hint of romance between Valjean and Fantine. Both are lacking in self-esteem, and frankly, Fantine is far too ill. Javert would not beat Fantine. This is quite unnecessary as he is the law, and he would not allow personal reaction to affect his duties. Furthermore, this encourages the audience to hate Javert, therefore losing audience sympathy and understanding at his death. Marius does not have the strength or ambition to lead the student revolt. Thénardier has all but disappeared. This is a mistake common to most English-speaking versions. The removal of Thénardier only accentuates the contrast between Valjean and Javert, diminishing our sympathy for Javert, who is seen as Valjean's evil enemy, rather than the principled, if mistaken and flawed, defender of society he is. The film ends with Javert's death, and there is little sadness or regret as Valjean witnesses the event. It is probably wrong to have Valjean witness the event at all. Javert's suicide is the result of inner turmoil, which is weakened by having him explain himself to Valjean. It should also be recalled that Valjean had saved his life at the barricades, and so he is unlikely to accept Javert's death without argument or some attempt to dissuade him from committing suicide. Having said all that, I found the film enjoyable in its own right, but I don't regard it as a very true or complete version of Hugo's tale. This French television adaptation, made in 2000, is one of my favourite versions, second only to the 1934 adaptation. Not to be confused with the 3-hour version in English, this version in French is 6 hours in length, has Depardieu as Valjean, Malkovich as Javert, is rich in detail and is emotionally engaging. What more can one ask? As with the 1934 version, this treatment is very full, rich in detail, and therefore retains the strength of the original. It contains a number of alterations to the narrative, but remains faithful to the essence of the characters, though I found Valjean's obsessive behaviour towards Cosette a little exaggerated, and too little emphasis laid on his sense of duty, responsibility and lack of self-esteem as his motivation. The direction is crisp, the script intelligent and engaging, and the acting convincing and moving. Depardieu is an excellent Valjean, articulate and ultimately tragic, while Malkovich is entirely convincing and unusually human as Javert. Christian Clavier is splendidly scheming, selfish and low as Thénardier, while Virginie Ledoyen is suitably appealing as Cosette. This is a confident and intelligent production which is not afraid of its origins. The 1934 version remains, and I suspect will always remain, my favourite. The key to Les Misérables is love, and the 1934 version succeeds in appealing to the heart better than any other I have seen. It is undoubtedly melodramatic in places, but this is perhaps a style which is not unsuitable for the recounting of Hugo's tale, and this may explain why more modern and realistic versions have fared less well in transferring the story to the big screen. This may also account for the inordinate success of the musical, which appeals to the heart and the spirit. In this 2012 film of the musical, the powerful soaring voices of the theatre are missing, replaced by a more intimate and perhaps more personal and emotional rendition entirely appropriate to the medium of cinema. It is with some difficulty that I accepted this change in emphasis. I am a great admirer of the musical and have obviously only hitherto seen it on stage. Of course, a little thought should have prepared me for the differences in storytelling technique. The cinema is a more immediate and intimate medium, and the theatrical saying, less is more, is ironically entirely fitting in this case, with the performances painted in fine brushstrokes as opposed to the necessarily broader and perhaps more powerful brushstrokes of the theatre. The songs become the dialogue rather than being projected as in the theatre, propelling the action and character development. Just as the original seems to carry musical theatre to a new level, so the film version takes film musical to new heights. Indeed, this may more properly be called a musical film. Beautifully directed by Tom Hooper, the camera moves almost constantly, imbuing the film with a certain energy, though this can become a little wearing at times. This, combined with sharp editing, remarkable attention to sets, makeup and costumes, a script which amplifies and clarifies various complexities of both plot and character, and performances which only enrich these production values, go to create a faithful and highly engaging version, not just of the stage show, but of the original book. Russell Crowe is perhaps a little disappointing, but his voice is acceptable. Curiously, his performance appears emotionally limited in places, yet he still effortlessly presents the principled but flawed Javert. Hugh Jackman gives what is probably the performance of his career, capturing the despair, hope, joy and torment of Valjean, and capturing the audience's hearts at the same time. Let us note in the passing that once again the Thénardiers are used for comic relief, their amorality always presented as amusing. While I willingly recognise the necessity for this, the omission of their underlying nastiness, displayed in the missing dog-eat-dog, does away with a whole layer of the original. But I suppose that is a minor personal gripe in the face of the inclusion of several equally important elements: the escape to the convent and meeting Fauchelevent, Gavroche's elephant and crew, the coverage of the barricade, the way in which Éponine meets her end, Marius' grandfather, even the old man spotted in the crowd at the barricade, all lovingly and faithfully reproduced from the book. The script by William Nicholson and direction by Tom Hooper capture the strength and detail of the original narrative, but above all they impart the themes and emotions Hugo so desperately wanted to share with his readers, and I am certain that, like the show on which it is based, Hugo would have been mightily and rightly proud of the efforts of all concerned with this production. My thanks for taking the time to watch this video. I hope you found it of some value.